to NeuroDiverse Generation, the podcast where we flip the script on what it means to thrive through neurodiversity. I'm your host, Jenna Evelyn, and today we're diving headfirst into the quirks, creativity, and challenges of the neurodiverse experience. Whether you're here to laugh, learn, or find a little inspiration, you've found your people. Please note that this program may not be suitable for younger viewers due to explicit language and mature themes. Parental guidance is advised. This show is aired for educational purposes. We are not licensed diagnosticians or counselors. Let's get the conversation rolling. Alison Jessica is a founder and award-winning entrepreneur in the construction industry in South Africa over the past 25 years. Alongside this, Ali has spent the last 6 years establishing herself as a successful author and speaker. What sets Alison apart is her vulnerable tone as a profound storyteller. She is known as a soul speaker. She believes it is her mission to use her voice as one of reconciliation, hope, and healing at a seminal time in our country's history. Alison's message is one of owning your story, living with grace, and stepping into the power of who you were truly meant to be. That is how we heal some of the anguish in the world, one conversation at a time. Good morning, Ali. How are you today?
Good, thank you.
I'm so thrilled to have you on the podcast because you have inspired so much of my own journey in terms of like feeling comfortable to actually come out and speak about what I've been through in a matter-of-fact sort of a way. Like, I don't care if you judge me or not, but this is my story and there's a lot of power in telling it. So I really wanted to ask you this morning, belonging touches on themes of identity and acceptance. So how did writing your memoir help you navigate your sense of belonging?
Writing my memoir made sense of my entire life. I never ever thought it would quite come full circle as it has. But what it did was it allowed me to track the pivotal moments in my life and what led me to this point in a way that unraveled the tapestry of who I've become and allowed me to restitch it together in a beautiful picture that started to finally make sense, and why it took so long for me to find my belonging. And so there were two kind of parallels. The one was writing it and making sense of that journey from from little girl growing up, the challenges I had, to political activist, to entrepreneur, to now speaker and writer. But the parallel thread alongside that was the personal journey to wholeness. So the one was the rite of passage, but the other is what happened to me to allow me to finally step into wholeness. Yes. So I think those are the two threads that came together and allowed me to say, this is who I am now. And this is my story. And if my story can help another person feel less alone and not wait 60 years to find their belonging, then that is why I came to Earth.
Yes. Oh, I love that. I love that, Ali. I love your motivation behind all of this. And there was something that I also picked up, particularly in the first few chapters of your book, it struck a chord in me, I should say, is the feeling of seeking external validation as opposed to validating oneself, right?
Yeah.
That's phenomenal.
A 60-year journey. And I think the fascinating bit about that is that I had become the eternal student of personal development. From the age of 32, I was attending courses, but no amount of trying to convince myself that I was good enough, or I couldn't tell myself with my mind. I had to, on a cellular level, live it in my body and my experience.
100%.
Where the shift came for me.
Oh, wow.
Not alone in the mind. I couldn't convince myself say, you know what, you better think better about yourself because, you know, it's not good. It didn't work like that.
It doesn't. It never does.
Go into my body and start to change the vibration of my own inner chemistry for me to be able to come out.
Absolutely. Because there's understanding things on a logical level, and then there's understanding things on an emotional level. And there's even this concept of emotion code, where your emotions actually, it's this theory that your emotions remain dormant and remain in your cells for decades to come. And as a result, you can pass certain emotional traumas along to your kids without realizing it, which is terrifying. But
in the depth of my journey, and I think this is an important part of the conversation, is that my not good enoughness actually impacted some of my family. And it took really looking at what was the cost, so that I could be a voice of hope and healing in just starting to address those intergenerational wounds, because there were patterns in my not good enoughness that I picked up from my past and intuitively and unwittingly brought into my mothering. And that's what I've had to look at and look very hard at in the mirror. But it's almost like walk this journey in order to get the bigness of the cost. I don't know if that makes sense.
I get what you're saying. I completely get it. It's almost, look, I went through, this was something that also made your book launch it really, really resonated with me. A lot of the questions that Kim asked you and a lot of your answers, because I almost had the other side of the coin when I was in high school. So, I mean, I was bullied like mad through primary school. I had a very, very low sense of self-worth and et cetera, et cetera. And by the time I got to high school, it was like that suddenly just flipped around. I went to a different school and suddenly I could be one of the main cast in the major production and I could achieve academically and I had friends and I meant something there. But simultaneously, I was going up like week after week up in assembly for an award for Miss High School South Africa 2018. Jenna went to New York to do this. Jenna went on a cruise and did this whole performance and whatever. And it sounds great and amazing on the surface. But every time I was walking up on that stage, like up the stairs, and I'm shaking the vice principal's hand and everything, the only thing that's going through my mind in that moment is, what's the next one going to be? Because I have to remain relevant. So it almost held absolutely no value for me. It was like hollow, you know, it was like a facade that I felt I had to like keep pushing forward in order to be of value in some way. I didn't feel like I could just be and exist and be valuable as such, you know?
I think the mirror on my side was becoming an award-winning entrepreneur. And no matter how many awards my team had amassed and been on television and radio and in magazines, I still didn't feel worthy. And it was only when I changed into a vulnerable storyteller that I could truly be myself, unarmored, unapologetically. And so that's where all the sense making came in.
Yes,
not
absolutely.
Validation, much like you saying, where I could just be permission to, this is who I am. I'm not an expert in anything. I'm just finding myself. And if that can help anybody else,
I'm just a fellow soul trying to like trip my way through this world, you know? How did your relationship with your bipolar father shape your understanding of mental health, both in your family and in society?
It's been a huge part of my journey. And growing up, I think I battled with my father because he was such a dominant figure and such a visionary and such a powerful man, but because the bipolar sparked so much sadness in our family. And my mother was constantly sad because the anguish of having a husband who was constantly threatening to commit suicide and drive off tired, squealing into the night, and then coming back hours later as if nothing had happened. And that was part of the madness. Like, was this night real? And then 2 weeks later, again, and you start to wonder, what's reality? Because you're starting to leave the schizophrenic existence, because one day things are fabulous and it's manic highs and it's larger than life. And then it's the absolute despair and rage. And so initially I battled with that. And even in the writing of the book and the reflecting, I realized how much my father hadn't been defined by his bipolar. He had had to live alongside it. But what it did was that it shaped me to have far greater compassion, to understand the roller coaster ride that he lived. Because at the time, bipolar hadn't been named. It didn't have a name in the 1960s. It was just battle depression, and he had to be on medication. And it was the stigma of it that almost killed him, because he railed against taking medication, and then he would take it for a while, and then things would be calmer, and then they would erupt again. So
100%.
He had around it. And so that was part of the anguish that we walked, was the roller coaster ride because of the stigma.
Yeah, 100%. Because I think, particularly when we think about the possibility of being diagnosed ourselves, it's kind of like, oh, well, this has to mean something. And even if it doesn't mean something to me and my family, it's something I have to keep under wraps because it's going to mean something to everyone else.
I think that was the big thing. And I think this is an important thread. He was district governor of Rotary. He represented Rotary at a very high level. So nobody knew the battles that were happening behind closed doors. And as a teenager at school, nobody, not my best friend, and I had different best friends at different times.
You and me both. They come and go.
Yeah, it was a hidden life. It was a hidden life. And so that journey of this other life that we led behind closed doors, only his business partner, who knew him well and was his best friend, essentially, kind of knew that there were these roller. So I think that's been a huge thread in my understanding, is that the more we speak the conversation, the more we give permission to give words, not to label, but to create support.
That ties in beautifully with what it means to live authentically. And I think, there's so much discussion about you must live authentically and don't be inauthentic and no. But what that truly means is having it's that integrity to oneself, in a sense, of having the same dialogue out there as you have in here, right? And living inauthentically can actually be incredibly damaging. And I think the real problem here is that so many neurodivergents are living inauthentically out of that fear of that stigma, out of that fear of, okay, this is going to mean something to everybody else and I've got to keep it under wraps. And it means that they have to live inauthentically in order to survive. So how would you reconcile that? How would you suggest a reconciliation of that? Someone who feels that who's listening to this perhaps, and they feel, okay, I see what they're saying. I don't think I'm living as my most authentic self. How can I reconcile those two narratives?
I think the more we speak the conversation,
Yes.
the more we open the doors for honest discussions about the challenges.
Yes.
And the more families understand what the challenges are, they can create more of a support network for other families navigating this road. So it's really lifting the lid on silence has become my mission, is to just literally lift the lid on this conversation and let's make it a conversation about the kindness of a spiral rather than a definitive label. Because I myself battle depression and anxiety, and I know there are days where the only way I could manage was to go to the gym and push heavy weights so that the feel like chemistry in my body, which is calmed down.
So that you
And
could
no
release it.
would actually release it as much as that. So I think the more we have discussions, like, for example, if you get onto the stage, as you did at the PSASA convention, and say, what I find challenging is X. What I find helpful and supportive is Y. The more others can learn from opening the lid of a conversation and literally bringing the tools out into the open with kindness and compassion and understanding, that very often our environment sparks things in a way that either aggravates the condition or actually makes it more malleable. So I think environment, I mean, Howard Gardner talks about multiple intelligences, and the environment, I believe, can play a huge role. I mean, I think you've experienced that. When your environment is supportive, you're much calmer, you're able to navigate it. But when you're overwhelmed, you go into paralysis. And then you just can't see the wood for the tree. So although I don't battle severe depression and anxiety anymore, it's something I literally lived through for decades, and emotional eating and bulimia and, things. So I think it's, the more we talk about it, the more language gives us the tools to navigate what are helpful environments. And in our education system, we're not geared. This is my biggest mission in life. I've got a few missions, as you know. Who does not allow an environment for these incredibly gifted children that come to the world with such unique talents and gifts? But society wants to box us into a certain way of learning and being. And you've lived that. You've literally lived that.
Big
and
time.
I had one child that was diagnosed ADD, and another one ADHD, bipolar father, bipolar other members of family, bipolar extended family. So I've literally lived alongside the experience of seeing how a positive, calm environment can assist people, and how a threatening environment can easily derail one.
I think, there's common threads I'm also picking up here, being the importance of honesty with oneself and one's, surrounding, family and support structure. And with that honesty, comfort and vulnerability, because that is really where you find your place in the world, is when you let go of your ego and you let go of this whole big I am and this big image that you want to project out there. And you become very raw and real about, this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm feeling like. I think also you mentioned something quite interesting about, the nature nurture debate, right? And I think that is a lot more intertwined than a lot of people realize, because when we learn about it in varsity, right? When I learned about it in varsity, it was a matter of, okay, nature means that you are born like instinctively that way. That's how you're wired. And then nurture means that it's your environment that impacts it. But what we don't realize is that in those formative years, it is your, it is your nurture or environment that shapes that nature. So they impact one another big time.
Absolutely. And I think that it's as much as the conversation around everything is connected, that we are intelligence and we're not just our minds. So holistic way of looking at things makes it a far more nuanced discussion. And we're looking for nuances, not labels. I think it's nuances that guide the education system. It's about the tone of people's lives. How do we a helpful tone in people's lives? If we understand the neurodiversity challenges, how do we create an environment, say you're in an office space, that's very calming, that works for you. I think it's going deeper into the sensitivity. What brings out people's unique genius? Because there is a genius in neurodiversity. It has been shown again and again and again that this incredible creativity, which I see in my family and in allied families, how do we tap into that neurogenius? The diversity is the genius. How do we unlock in our understanding of humanity going forward?
There is an important distinction between mental illness or mental health and neurodiversity. Mental illness can be cured, neurodiversity cannot. You write about your relationship with food as having a clear connection to not only your mental state, but as an influential factor in your mental health specifically. So can you tell us a little bit more about what that connection looked like for you?
Sure. I think the whole emotional eating sparked as a result of my father's bipolar roller coasters.
Yes.
So my siblings were sporty, they buried themselves in sport. It was, that was their escape. I didn't have that. I was complex, quiet, introverted, loved books and reading. Felt like I didn't belong in my own family, which I then launched. And so that journey of emotional eating sparked a whole pattern. And it wasn't until I, over decades, came to terms with how emotions were driving my eating. And it wasn't until I was able to really navigate those emotions that the whole eating patterns became completely different. And from eating to control to remain slim at all costs, because there was a lot of sort of body image expectations being in a sporty family. And so it was navigating that and coming to terms with the fact that I could, when it was no longer about control, and it shifted from control, because when I was 52, I started going on a health journey, started gymming, started running, but the running was still a mechanism of control. Like if I run half marathons, I'll be able to eat whatever I can, whatever I need, and it will keep my weight under control. But it was still a control element. Whereas when I went into a journey deeper in my 60s, in the deeper work, in the soul work, and it became no longer about my body, but about my soul, that's when things just changed completely for me. And so I have not weighed myself for 7 years, not once. If I go to the doctor, I say, write down the number, keep it on file, don't tell me. I haven't known what my weight is for 7 years, because I never ever want to be tormented by a number on the scale ever again. Because I would stand, having got down to 58, and I'm fairly tall, and I willed it down to 52 kilograms, flirting on the fringes of anorexia, taking laxatives to just make that scale drop 1 iota more, because maybe then I'd be lovable, maybe then I'd be popular, maybe then I'd belong, maybe I would belong. And now my nutrition is based on conscious leadership. I eat in a conscious, intentional way to live a life of peak performance in my mid-60s and have energy like you would not believe. I've been sick this last week, but apart from that, I live life at a hell of a tilt. I think
she really does.
And I need to operate in peak performance like an athlete to live this life of intentional, conscious contribution. So it's part of me loving myself enough to feed myself the food that feeds my soul, not the shape of my body. So I have changed not just the shape of my body, but the very shape of my soul.
That is incredibly empowering. And it's why I've got partially why I've got so much respect for you and for what you do. Because wouldn't you say that once the internal is aligned the way things should be, the external tends to reflect it?
Unbelievably so. Unbelievably so.
Wow. Can you describe a pivotal moment in your journey when you realized you had to take ownership of your story and step into the spotlight?
I was always quite a shy person growing up. So the whole journey to visibility has been hugely challenging for me.
I'll bet, yeah.
I was a visible political activist in the trenches, not the person, in the front lines. The pivotal moment came in my life at 60 years old, where I attended a global summit. And it was global storytellers that literally changed my life from a stage. Not the how-to speakers, not that this is how to do life. It was people that stood up there without a single slide in sight and just vulnerably told their story.
Yeah.
And I walked out of the auditorium with one of those global storytellers, and I was not the same person. And that's what made me become a speaker and a writer, because I realized the power of words to change people's self-perception or to plant a seed that they maybe had a story to tell. And so since I turned 60, it's been an unfolding journey of me claiming that voice. And as I said before, it just kind of made sense of my whole life. But the visibility thing is quite daunting for me.
Yeah.
I'm not one of those mega confident, I used to battle huge social anxiety. I used to go away for a week with friends and be tortured. The weekend. Yes. Because
it's not just
the anxiety was so huge. What am I going to wear? What am I going to eat? It was like I already instead of just going away and having fun with friends who dear to me and who wonderful and who love me as I am. So there was this whole prelude. It was like putting armor on before I went. I think the shift has come. I don't have to wear armor anymore. This is who I am. And there's such liberation in that. So yesterday, for the first time, it was a moment in my life. I got this message that my book Belonging had been carried in 5 international global publications, the launch of it, speaking about the message of the book, from Atlanta to Nebraska to the different places in the US and the UK. And it was, Jenna, I had to breathe. I had to go, you are just the messenger. This is not about you anymore. This is no longer about Alison Jessica. This is the message of belonging, and you are merely the messenger. Wow. And when I got that last night, I could just breathe it in and say, I'm just the messenger. I'm doing the best I can. So yesterday was a big day in my life. Big day.
Wow. Oh, that's amazing, Ali. And I identify with that in the context that I'm a scuba diver, right? My dad and I love to scuba dive together. We've got tons of hilarious photos and videos from underwater, and we always have a blast. One of the reasons that I love diving as much as I do is because when you go down there, whether it's good visibility, bad visibility, there's a surge, there's a current, whatever, everything is quiet down there. And it means that nothing up there can touch me for these 55 minutes that I'm on this dive down here. Nothing up there can touch me. And simultaneously, that gives me incredible comfort in my own insignificance in the world. And I think I've gotten like tattoos about it, because it was a massive realization for me, also coming from where I come from, that, you know, I don't have to be this massive significant person. I don't have to put this egotistical brand forward for the rest of the world to see. Because if anything, who I am as a human being, as a person, in my most peaceful, quiet moments, that's what I've got to answer for at the end of the day, when I'm lying on my deathbed.
And that's the journey of becoming whole.
Wow.
I believe. The journey of becoming whole is quietening those other voices so that you can hear your own voice more and more. And I think when you go below the surface, Jenna, it's a metaphor for life.
Yeah.
It is truly a metaphor for life. And when we go quiet into the ocean, it's blue ocean thinking. And it's quiet, and it's still, and it's nature.
Oh, bliss. My therapist was asking me to find my happy place the other day in one of our sessions. And she said, just describe it to me. What does it look like? And I closed my eyes and it was the first thing that came to mind. I was like, I'm not even diving. I'm just on one of those, you know, those rubber ducky boats that the divers go out on. I'm on one of those. I'm completely alone. I've got no shelter from the sun. I'm there in my swimming costume. I can see the coastline kind of a little bit away, and it's a sunny day, and I can just feel the water rocking me, and I can hear the sounds of the ocean around me. And it immediately brings my vibrations down to slightly lower energy, and I can suddenly think a little bit more clearly, and it's an incredibly powerful tool. But it comes down to, like you said, delving deeper into that emotional layer, that goes beyond logic.
Yes.
Wow.
Yeah.
I love that.
I think it's helpful to look constantly at everything as a spectrum. I think the biggest breakthrough in the whole field of neurodivergence has come from the understanding of a nuanced spectrum.
Yes.
There's
Oh,
one
it comes
shot
down to that.
between one and the other. I mean, you look at dementia, you look at Alzheimer's, you know, the elements that overlap, the elements that
Hugely.
I think the gentleness with which you look at the spectrum and the gentleness with which you regard yourself as a spiral that's sometimes going up and down. I sometimes hit a downward spiral, and I have to find a way to shift the spiral because it's not static. I don't wake up one day like X and another day like Y. I might wake up one day slightly anxious, and I have to go there and just kind of find a way to navigate through that anxiety, to sit with it. But it doesn't help to beat myself up about it.
No,
because that has its own reaction. So I think the way we deal with spirals and support, what is supportive to the journey, both in the environment, the whatever form of therapy it is, discussions, family discussions, all of that is what brings healing into the conversation so that it's less definitive. Because the spectrum is the spectrum of genius and the spectrum of our own internal daily programming. And so the two, we have to navigate with kindness alongside one another. So it's really about support versus label for me. That is, you know, the diagnosis is only to support, not to label.
Yes,
not to box.
Absolutely. And it's up to us to decide which one of those that becomes.
Exactly. I think that's where the world is going to, in terms of understanding how we used to, as a sociologist, we used to live, because I'm a sociologist by background, we used to live in a very collective environment. We we were tilling the fields. And if we had mental issues, and family knew, but we had to till the fields. And life was very literal in its having to be productive. It was a collective consciousness. It was a collective economy. Even sometimes in different communities, you'll find far more collective ways of being. Whereas often in our Western societies, we're very, very isolated. People stay, they've got a dog, they don't go and talk to their neighbors, they live in silos. We have gone from a collective consciousness and a collective way of living to living in isolated silos. So I believe the healing comes in opening up that conversation, of allowing that individual expression to allow the silos to talk to one another.
Oh, that's stunning. And I couldn't wait to ask you this question because of the fact that it's much the same as the nature-nurture debate. We were talking about neurodivergence versus mental health or mental illness. One's curable, one's not. But they are also so heavily interlinked because there are comorbidities that come alongside neurodivergent conditions that are manageable and that don't necessarily have to be the case, which just goes to prove neurodiversity does not have to be a disorder. It becomes a disorder when these things manifest in unhealthy ways because we haven't, how do I say it? I can't even say take charge of our neurodiversity because it's just the opposite. You've got to surrender to it.
I think that's the fascinating journey that we see more and more. Broadening the understanding of how we maximize those incredible strengths and harness the superpower that lies in the silo of unique diversity.
Oh, yes. And remembering that we are a social species at the end of the day. A lot of these difficulties and these downward spirals are based on those social interactions for a reason. And so if we can become a lot less individualistic and a lot more about creating a sense of community with one another, it can go such a long way, I think. As someone who grew up with a neurodiverse parent, what insights do you have about creating a supportive environment for children in similar situations?
We did not talk about things at all. When my father would drive off, tires squealing into the night, none of us spoke to one another. It was as if it wasn't happening. We all went into our own individual pain. My mother was sad and crying. I felt her sadness pervading the entire house. She'd already lost both her father and her brother in individual air accidents. So then she's in a marriage and her husband is threatening to drive over Solari's Pass regularly. So the sadness in our home pervaded everything. And so if I look at that, I wish I'd had somebody to speak to say, this is the craziness I'm living in. I don't know if I'm going crazy, but we didn't speak about it. None of us. And it was the silence that made it more crazy.
Yeah.
If I can do that. So I think for families undergoing that, if you have support systems where families can talk to one another, and this is what helped me, and that's the importance of this podcast. That's the importance of this podcast. That somebody might be listening and saying, my child feels very alone, and I don't know how to make them feel like they belong.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Here today helps others, make them feel like they belong.
And that, Ali, wow. You're a poet. You know that. You're a poet. You're speaking to my soul at the moment. And I think, like, speaking from a child's perspective, from the neurodiverse child's perspective, I know that my mom and my dad felt that they needed to put forward this persona to me of like, we've got it all together, we've got this under control, we know what we're doing. And that is not reassuring to a child in this context. What that child wants to see is your vulnerability, is you saying, you know, I feel like I made a mistake here and I'm currently trying to figure this out, but I think I'm going to do this in future. And if mom or dad does make a mistake, to say, I'm sorry, I fucked up, you know?
Honesty. I think it's the honesty
Yes.
And you know, we don't come, unfortunately, with a parent textbook.
Especially for the neurodiverse kids, right?
For the neurodiverse kids. And I wish I'd known more, particularly with my daughter.
I mean, Nikki hasn't written the neurodiverse manual yet, so how would we know? Shout out, Nikki.
I wish I knew now, or wish I knew back then a little bit more, but I was in my own trauma. I was in my own patterned emotional
turmoil.
Starting a company when my kids were 2 and 3 years old against all. Now that I know so much more, I wish I'd navigated some things with so much more sensitivity. That's probably one of the most anguishful things in my life, was how my lack of sensitivity and lack of understanding could have impacted my daughter, my son, I think less so, but it's about stopping the intergenerational wounds of the patterns repeating and repeating and repeating.
Absolutely.
And the more we have kindness, the more we can navigate with support and influence, but with kindness towards ourselves as parents, but for kindness, understanding the noise. You spoke at the convention about the noise, noise. And I didn't realize my daughter was navigating so much noise. And so I dealt with her like a strict parent.
My mom had a similar experience, I think. But what's important, I think, to remember, Ali, because I identify with you in a lot of ways, one of which being that we seem to be quite self-critical. I mean, naturally, like inclined to be that way. And I think remembering that you were doing the best you could with what you had at that point in time is an important little dose of grace that you have to offer yourself in this context, because you have made such a massive difference in the growth that you've had as a person, and the way that you've been able to share that with everyone, your kids included, has completely changed things. I mean, if I think about my relationship with my parents, I had no relationship with my parents for about a decade. And now in some ways, I know that there's this underlying feeling of, oh, well, maybe we have to make up for lost time now. But simultaneously, the only thing that's in the back of my mind is I'm going to make the most of right now. Because ultimately, when my mom and dad aren't here anymore, I want to be able to, you know, stand up at their funeral and talk about the wonderful things that have happened without a sense of regret. And I can't change what's happened in the past, but I can say that what has happened in the past is the reason my bond is so strong with them now.
Yes. If we can turn the mess into the message, that is the story of my book. That is the story of my book, is how I found my belonging, and how all the stuff I dealt with, the shame around things that went wrong.
Oh, that's a big one.
And the residue of sadness that I didn't have tools or the openness or the willingness or just the space
to navigate.
To navigate that has been, let at least my life be a legacy that my story matters for somebody else. For somebody else to feel less alone. And if there's some 16-year-old reading my book and feeling less alone, then that's why the words plopped onto the page. That's grace.
And by the way, for everyone listening, we're going to pop the link in the description below as to where you can buy Ali's book, because it is well worth a read. And if you're lucky and you know her personally like me, she might even write you a beautiful message in the front. You know, if you're special, because everyone wants to be special in this day and age. But hashtag you can't sit with us.
I just did 2 book launches, one in Johannesburg, one in Cape Town. And so exclusive books are stocking it now, and it's getting more and more traction, both globally and in South Africa. And I think it is because of its vulnerable tone.
Oh,
it's not a book. It's not a how-to book. It's an evocative book. It evokes a response in you. It does not prescribe a response.
And as a creative, that's also there's a huge side to it in that, because it's in our art, in our creativity, in these expressions that we evoke emotion in other people, and it is emotion that motivates people to take action.
It is.
Particularly for neurodivergence, emotion's a big one.
I know. And even though I might not be formally labeled X or Y in terms of the spectrum, I believe I have an exaggerated sensitivity because of my journey. I feel like my antennae have been exposed in a way that somebody else might not have.
Yes.
And so the fascinating thing, Jenna, is that the more I speak about it, the more I heal. And I spoke on Tuesday at an event. I'm speaking at 2 more events next week. I'm speaking with you this morning. The more I speak my journey, the more my words heal myself and heal others.
Going through these podcasts one by one has been incredibly cathartic for me as well. When it comes to consciously unmasking and allowing my ADHD and the way that my ADHD brain works to just kind of run free and do its thing has been incredibly liberating for me. And so you're so right. We heal ourselves and we heal other people through a journey like that. Have you found that others with similar experiences have reached out to you after reading Belonging? And how has that influenced your work moving forward?
It's a little bit surreal as I'm sitting here, because there were 3 times where I stood poised above the bin with manuscripts in my hands. And I had bits of history all over the spare room and there, and bits of research. And this is a lot of history behind the way in which I present the backdrop of growing up in apartheid South Africa. And 3 times, something stopped me. And by the 3rd time, I kind of knew that this isn't about me anymore. But it was hard, because becoming so raw and so vulnerable is, I was worried. I think one of my overarching fears was, what will the family think? What will the family think? I'd grappled with approval my whole entire life. And here I was putting out a book that was so raw and so vulnerable. I wrote naked, literally. I wrote without armor. Brené Brown said, courage is not the absence of fear. It's the absence of armor. And so, having been so raw and so real, that is where the healing came. Because others then came to me and said, your book changed my life. I didn't realize I had a story to tell. So that's been the journey of me finally owning my story. And if I can inspire somebody else to own that part of themselves that might heal, and that together we can all be voices of compassion, then that's how we heal the world, one conversation at a time, not one textbook at a time.
I love that. I think I might just make that the slogan of my podcast, actually. You know, healing the world one conversation at a time. I love that. Oh, ideas. Addie, you need to be on my marketing team. Thank you so much for this incredible conversation and these incredibly valuable insights. You have so much wisdom to offer. And I think really everyone who's listening, you have nothing but benefit to gain from reading Ali's book. It's incredibly moving. It's incredibly powerful. And I think it's very empowering from a point of view of not quite a how-to, but an emotional flick of the switch that makes one realize what you are truly capable of. So please, please, please check out the links in the description. If you're in South Africa or anywhere where they have an exclusive books, pop in, get yourself a copy, and you're welcome to reach out to Ali and myself. Where can they find you, Ali?
You can follow my journey on LinkedIn, Facebook, Instagram. I'm starting to do a little bit more TikTok, the kind of topics I touch on.
Yes.
And, you know, there's a reason why Taylor Swift has the following she has.
Yes. Yes.
Let's get down to people are dismissive and they say, it's because she makes people feel less alone.
Absolutely. And she talks about experiences that we all go through.
Yeah.
And emotions we all feel.
So I believe that if I can be the voice of feeling less alone, then that makes sense of my whole life. That's even beautiful. Though 60 years to reach that point. But maybe it had to take 60 years so that I could stand on stage and say, don't wait 60 years to own your story, to claim who you came to be.
Yes. For sure, for sure. That's exactly what I was going to say. I heard you say, even though it took 60 years, and I was like, maybe it's because it took 60 years. That's gorgeous. Everyone, thank you so much for tuning in. Everyone who's listening, please tune in for another episode next week, same time. Ali, thank you again. You are phenomenal. We'll pop all the links for where you can find Ali's book and where you can contact her and follow her journey in the description below. We'll see you next week. Have a lovely one.
Been so special, Jenna. So special.